welcome back to what I would like to call a special summer edition of The Doctor Will See You Now. A month ago, I had the wonderful pleasure of discussing with this author about his work that was in process, that, were we going to see this work available to the public, available in ebook and available in paperback, and here we are. It's there, it's happened. So please welcome with me, if you will, D.L Marshall, in for consultation. I'm going to call him Danny. It makes it seem so much more personal in the doctor's surgery. Danny, it is absolutely wonderful to be here a year later. So much to celebrate. How does it feel for you?
Thank you. A mixture of excitement and relief just to see it finally out there. Yeah, it's been a long journey. Thank you.
It's a total pleasure. And if you will, I'm going to ask you about that journey to this point. But we're here to talk about Anthrax Island, of course, a thriller published by Canelo. And the ebook was out in March 2021.
Mid-March.
Yeah, and then the paperback was out in May 2021. So again, we love hearing about our authors, we love finding about their work, but there's a special something when it's that debut novel that, it's like, oh, wow. It almost makes you feel like, the birth of a first child. It's a very precious moment. And I think, given our journey together from Newcastle Noir, and to feel that book. Do you have a copy of the book with you?
I do. So I should have done the proper thing and had one behind me, shouldn't I? But there
That's
it is.
Beautiful. Look at that. That is gorgeous. I was doing mine's on an ebook version, so it just doesn't have the same thing to hold it up like that.
Let's pop it there.
That is beautiful.
I hope it stays.
Brilliant. That's it. That's gorgeous. So when did this book first begin, and when did you first start the journey into being a published author? Take us back on that trajectory.
I must say, I think I first started writing anything at all back end of 2014. Mm-hmm. And the first thing I ever wrote, I dived straight in and wrote a novel, and it ended up being it's not something that ever went anywhere. It's saved in a folder in my computer somewhere. It ended up being a horror novel set in Yorkshire. But as I came to the end of that, I started getting an idea for a locked room murder mystery, a true sort of impossible crime, and I started writing at the same time a crime novel, which at that time was set on a ship. It followed similar events, but it felt really sort of generic. It didn't really stand out. It didn't have much going for it, and I was kind of losing a bit of enthusiasm with it. And at the same time, I'd been reading about this fantastic island off Scotland, which I'll talk about in a second. And I thought that'd just be a fantastic location to set a book, and it lent itself to sort of a horror novel, something like that. So I started thinking about that. And then I thought, no, wait a minute, I've got this idea for this locked room murder mystery that takes place in an isolated location. So that's surely the best location for it. And I kludged the two together and came up with one novel out of those two. And I think I wrote the first draft in around 2015. Mm-hmm. So it's been a long time coming to this point. Yeah, six years.
Now, if the facts that I have before me are correct, in 2016 you pitched at Bloody Scotland, that amazing crime fiction festival up in Stirling. What was the reception? I mean, did you pitch from Anthrax Island? Was that the?
I did, yeah. It had a different title at the time, which was one of the sticking points on the panel, actually. Yeah, I was selected to pitch. And at that time, I'd called it Outpost 32, which sounds a little sci-fi and a little horror. And I ended up going last out of 8 people and got to listen to 7 wonderful pictures before mine. So the nerves were just ramping up and ramping up and ramping up. It was awful. And the person sat next to me was Alison Belsham, who wrote Tattoo Thief, who pitched at that point The Tattoo Thief, and got the best reception from the panel and ended up winning it. And I had to follow her, which was unfortunate for me. But the reception was good. I got some brilliant feedback. What I took away from it was it wasn't quite ready, because there were a number of suggestions. So the first thing was, I'd set it in 1982, which is a period that really interests me. I love the 80s. I'm all about the retro, and anyone who's watching could pick out a million things behind me that point to that. But I'd set it in 1982, and it had nods to sort of The Professionals and old Bond movies and things like that. And one of the things that stuck with me was try and make it contemporary, try and set it now. Think of a way that you can set this story in the present day. So I took some time away and reworked it and came back with a much better, much cleaner novel that became Anthrax Island.
I mean, even now, listening, how things went, what strikes me is your dedication in not letting something go. So that idea of blending ideas together, pitching it and taking on board advice, pointers, and rather than thinking, as is often the case, so many authors say, I just put it in a drawer. I'm not bothered about it. But you didn't give up on this idea.
I mean, don't get me wrong. I got very close several times. I came away from it quite dejected, because it was. You go with these ideas. It was the first thing I'd ever been to, the first writing event. I didn't even know writing events really were a thing until I applied, because I'd seen an advert for it. And I went with all these ideas that there was going to be a room full of publishers, and I took several copies with me for all the people that were surely going to ask me to read it. And of course, nobody did, because that's not how things work. So of my own making, I came away quite low. And I'd set unrealistic expectations. So at that point, I was really close to giving in. But on the way out, I bumped into Mary Hannah, and she stopped me and basically, in no uncertain terms, told me not to give it up.
Fabulous.
So that's one of the points at which I could have. But there's a few more along the way where I almost let it go. But I thought, no, I'd really like to see it out there. I'll really keep on with it.
Because 2018 you won the Northern Writers Award.
I won one of the prizes, yeah.
Yeah.
There's several then, and Mari had convinced me to apply with Anthrax Island, as it had then evolved into. And I did, and I won one of the prizes, which was fantastic. It was a read by TLC, the literary consultancy, who provide feedback on manuscripts. And so off it went to them for some professional feedback. It got a read by a well-known crime writer who came back with something like a 10-page report on it. And what was really good, there were some brilliant points in there of things I could tweak and change to improve the story. But the main takeaway from that was the novel that I had by that point actually was okay. It was decent, because a lot of the feedback was really good. So that's kind of the turning point, really, where I started really sort of putting more effort into it and polishing it.
And how did you get to being with Canelo? I mean, I think you're a fabulous publisher, but what was that little journey to Canelo?
They're brilliant. It's again full of ups and downs, like all the little sort of mini stories along this path. On the back of the changes I'd made, then I submitted it to who I thought was my preferred agent, who, if I could be represented by anybody in the world, I'd want to be represented by this particular person. And for long story, I hadn't sent him Anthrax Island. I'd sent it to loads of other agents along the way and been rejected by all of them, and I hadn't sent it to him, and he was my number one. And I'd kind of held back, and there's reasons for that. But anyway, I eventually sent it to him, and he read it, and he requested the full thing, and he read it, and he was, as he was reading it over the weekend, he read it in a weekend, and he was emailing me. Bear in mind, I wasn't a client at that time. I was just, you know, hoping that he liked it. And he was emailing me as he was reading it, and sort of got little references to, you know, films and books that I'd thrown in there. And by the end of the weekend, by Sunday night, he said he wanted to call me on Monday morning, and that was that. So that was brilliant. But then we went from there to submitting it out to publishers, which didn't go quite so well. And we collected lots of rejections before back end of last summer. I did a reading on a special virtual noir at the bar that Vic was running, and Canelo got in touch on the back of that, and they'd had somebody on there, and they'd really like to see the full thing. It sounded like it was up their street, so off it went.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. So here we are, Anthrax Island, that locked room mystery. And I'd like to start off, if we can, because very often as readers, you know, it's that main protagonist that takes us on, you know, that we want to know more about this character. We engage with that character, you know, and your main character is John Tyler. Yeah.
Yes.
So to introduce us to John and talk about the formation of him. I mean, has he always been with you, or did he pop up later on as it was happening? Who's John?
He's obviously evolved as a character, but he was always the protagonist since I started writing what would really become Anthrax Island. He was always the protagonist. The thing that really changed, and there's a very slight spoiler, although it's probably not a spoiler to anyone that's even read the back of the book. He's flown out to the island as a replacement technician for the previous technician who's died, and he's not really a technician. He's there for other reasons, and that's really the only thing that changed throughout writing the novel, because he was a technician at first. And that changed because I thought, how can I carry this forward into a series? How can I evolve this character? Why is this character there? So I started really thinking hard about that. And what I kind of landed on was he's basically a sledgehammer to crack a walnut, really, because he's a mercenary that's more at home in the Middle East and war zones around the world. He's a brute force kind of chap, and he's used here in this novel really as a sort of an undercover detective, which he's totally a fish out of water, no backup. And I just thought it'd be fab to see what somebody like that would do in that situation. We all know, you know, police procedurals, and we've got detectives who can utilize forensics and CCTV and, you know, these fingerprints and DNA and everything like that. And it's very difficult actually to get away with major crime these days, you know, statistically. But what if we had a guy dropped on the island who didn't have access to any of that, didn't have a background in any of that, wasn't a detective whatsoever? How would he solve a crime? And he'd go at it brute force again, really, is the answer.
So if, in a way, you know, you've talked to us about John, and I just wonder if John were real, yeah, what is it that, you know, would you be friends with him? Would you like this guy?
I'd struggle to keep up with him for a start, because I'd probably carrying a couple more stones than he is, although he's probably more damaged than me. So, you know, swings and roundabouts. I like to think I would be, but I very much doubt that he has many friends. He's a bit of a loner, so probably wouldn't be friends with me. But he's a decent guy. I mean, he's a brilliant character because he's neither right nor wrong. He's not a white knight. He's not you know, a hero. He's very much an anti-hero, and that kind of becomes clear in some of the backstory that's hinted at throughout the novel, and he's explored in more detail in in the sequel. He's fairly amoral character. No, that's not true. He has his own morals.
His own morals. Yeah, that personal code. And very often I think, you know, the anti-hero, whilst, you know, we may not totally agree, you know, if we were to step back and say, oh, you know, what's going on, would we agree with this? But within the context of the novel, you know, and we love them for what they do. It's vital, it's necessary. You chose to write John, you know, first person narrative. What did you set off with him as that? Was that how you wanted that to be, for his voice to be heard?
The reason for that, well, there's a couple of reasons really. But the first is the first thing I ever wrote, that old horror novel that's in the bottom of a drawer, I wrote sort of third person and followed a couple of different points of view. And I wanted to try something a bit different. And I wrote a short story, which was kind of, again, it's sort of a horror slasher crime short story in which I used first person. And I really, really enjoyed writing it. Most of all because I enjoyed the unreliable narrator aspect. Not a narrator that lies to you, because that's cheating, but that might play with you know, perceptions of things. And I really, really enjoyed that. So I thought when I started writing Anthrax Island that I'll go with that again. And of course, there are a lot of the influences for Anthrax Island are those great thrillers of the 70s, 60s, and 70s, which usually use first person, and I wanted to capture some of that as well.
Yeah, it's beautiful. The location then, I mean, because, you know, I think, you know, often we talk about, you know, location and place being another protagonist, but in this, you know, locked room mystery set out on this island, the island really is, you know, plays such an important part in, you know, in your novel. Tell us about how you came to find out about this island.
I honestly can't remember where the first time I heard about it, but it wasn't that long ago. You know, it was around the time I was researching. I would say about 5 or 6 years ago. I stumbled across an article on Grignard Island. So it's a real place. It was used by the MOD during the Second World War to test anthrax and they think other biological weapons too. But the problem with anthrax is it stays lethal for decades, even centuries. It's really difficult to clean up because the spores are extremely hardy. And the British government found that when they left the island, it was extremely contaminated. And they sent teams every year and then every few years to check the levels of contamination. And every time they tested the island, it was just as contaminated as it was in 1942 when they undertook the tests. And then finally in the 80s, they decontaminated the island, and in the 90s, the files were declassified and everything came out. And people had suspected that things had gone on there for quite a long time. It's only just off the mainland, so rumours were always rife in the locality. But everything came out in the mid-90s, and that's when the media coined this name for the island, Anthrax Island. So I didn't name it.
Yeah.
I really wanted it to be another character. I really wanted it to be as hostile to John Tyler as the other characters in the novel are. Yeah.
Researching anthrax. How did you have to go deep into this, or was there so much information readily available as to, the effects that anthrax has on human organism, other living beings?
We're so lucky these days with the internet, aren't we? Because even just Wikipedia on its own can give you a basis in anything, but you can go deeper from there. So I've researched on the Imperial War Museum archives. There's footage of the tests taking place actually during the war. There's pictures of everything they were doing there. There's pictures from the 80s from the cleanup. I've been all around sort of military sites on anthrax used in Iraq, and the weapons investigators that went out there to search for biological weapons, of course, and found traces of the same strain of anthrax. And the the anthrax injections that the British Army were given to go out to Iraq, they think is one of the causes potentially of Gulf War syndrome, or one of the contributing factors to it, possibly. So it was a load of fun to research.
Did you at any point, because I mean, declassified, and did you come up at any point against, I don't know, any, not hostility, but was it, were there any official sort of like problems with you doing your research?
No, not with the research. No, I mean, everything's in the public domain now, thankfully. There's even videos of people who've landed on the island now, which is supposedly all cleaned up and fine, has been sold back into private hands. But people still go there and film themselves there and things like that. So you can find videos of things. So no, nothing like that. The only thing that I did have was my publisher. There's a section in the novel, there's a couple of bits that sort of take you back to what happened during the 40s and the reason for the contamination on the island. And one of the stories I came across was about a soap manufacturer, London-based soap manufacturer, who were contracted by the government to produce anthrax-infected cattle cakes to drop over Germany to decimate the cattle population in Germany. Fortunately, never happened. But this company were boasting how many of these cakes they were managing to turn out. So many thousand per day to go into these boxes to be loaded into planes if the need arose. And I put all that in, and I named the company, which is all in the public domain. And we took that out because said company hold a warrant to supply soap to the royal family and don't mention any of their involvement in this on their website for some reason. So we took all of that out and sort of anonymized some of it. I think it probably would have been fine because, again, it is all in the public domain, it is all fact. I didn't make any of that stuff up. But nobody wants to be associated with that kind of thing, do they?
I can imagine, or even second-hand, third-hand association. It might cause problems. Now, so that magical formula, okay, that you've got of blending fact and fiction, did it was it a happy union, or were there moments where you struggled tremendously in trying to marry these two aspects together?
Yeah, I did, and I tell you, that's the reason that I originally set it in the early 80s, because the island itself was decontaminated in the mid 80s. They went back and started doing these huge contamination surveys in the early 80s that led up to about 1986, I think, when they fully launched a huge campaign to clean the island up. And then it was the very early 90s when they declared it anthrax free. So that's the reason that the story was set in 1982. Over and above all the reasons that, I love retro stuff, and I got to sneak in loads of references to all sorts of things going on at the time. But when I changed it to be set now, I had to slightly adapt that. Why would the scientists be there now if the island is clean? So that was a struggle to sort of rewrite all of that sort of thing. I did want quite a lot. I wanted as much as possible, obviously, to be based on fact in terms of the history of the island. So there's an awful lot where it talks about the history is fact. But again, I had to embellish some bits and take some poetic license. The geography of the island is fairly accurate. The surrounding locations fairly accurate. There is the village of Lade with its slipway just across the bay there. Where the story sort of goes towards its conclusion. It's a slightly fictionalized version of the village and of its layout. And there's a car chase towards the end that's along a sort of fictionalized version of the road that I've driven along there up there. So it's a balance.
So have you been on the island?
Not the island, and I've been close to it. I got stopped by a blizzard because I went up in November, stupidly, late November, and I drove up as far as Inverness, and then the next morning set off and drove another sort of hour and a half, couple of hours up through the snow to get to the coast. And unfortunately it was just too bad, and my girlfriend was in the car and she was heavily pregnant at the time.
Not a good idea.
So we turned around, because we're talking, fairly remote northwestern Scotland, for somebody who lives in close proximity to towns and cities and hospitals and things like that, like me, is not a good idea with a pregnant girlfriend.
Not at all. No, all the wrong scenarios I can just envisage. Do you think when it's possible though? I mean, pandemic and everything. Do you think you will go?
Absolutely, yeah. I'd love to. I really want to go up, and in particular, there's a bookshop in Ullapool, which I guess is the nearest, as the crow flies, must be the nearest sizable place, I think. And they stocked a few copies of the book and have been selling them, and I sent them some signed book plates so that they could get those out there. So I'd love to visit that bookshop. I'd love to go up.
And I think just think it'd be so lovely, to be able to go over and stand on the island with the book, that inspiration of a place.
I'd absolutely love to. Yeah. I definitely will get up there at some point.
Now, there's another set of characters that I'd like us to talk about, if that's okay, and that's the group of scientists that are on the island. I wonder if you could say a little bit about the dynamic between them, and how you came, to that number. Were there some you've left out? Were there some that you wished you could put in, but it would just have been too many?
I did originally want more. I thought an operation of that size would have sort of lots of people scurrying around, laying pipes and digging soil and things like that. But it became kind of unfeasible and unrealistic. And what I wanted to create was that sort of real sort of paranoia and claustrophobia of a really small cast of characters stuck on the island with no help, and then there were none scenario. So I whittled it right down and came up with the characters from there. But it was quite early on in the novel. Thankfully, I didn't have to redo too much. So it is a very small cast. Off the top of my head, I can't just remember now, but I think we start with 10 in all, and it gets whittled down fairly rapidly from that. But I knew I wanted international cast, or at least a few different nationalities in there to play off, and I wanted a few different personality types in there, and I really wanted, again, and then there were none, I wanted to capture that sort of feeling of, there's a couple of upper class types in there, there's a couple of sort of more working class people, there's the scientists who really kind of know what's going on but are fairly gormless, and you've got Tyler, who's kind of banging his head against a brick wall trying to work his way around them. So I wanted those kind of almost sort of pastiche Agatha Christie style characters, but at the same time I wanted them to be fairly believable, and sort of not have them as cartoon characters.
Yeah, because I think, again, the idea of a Lockroom mystery, immediately, anybody who reads crime fiction will be thinking Agatha Christie, and not wanting, I liked when we started talking how, you'd had the idea of, when initially I'm thinking, this is just too generic, this is too, I need to do something more. And I think, one of the dangers is, the whole thing of the Lockroom mystery. How do I avoid just being a copycat? But I think, but it's so important that we write that kind of thriller, because, and in so many ways the claustrophobia that you evoke, again, without giving too much away or anything, but, there's more than once that I think as a reader, you end up trying to catch your breath, which is wonderful. The plotting that you did for this and those twists that you have in it, again, were they there? Did you know, or as you were writing, did some come to you?
Some evolved naturally. as I was writing, the central plot and the impossible murder, which I'm not giving any spoilers away by saying one of the scientific team is murdered inside a room with Tyler and everybody else kind of pretty much right outside the door. And when they enter seconds later, the murderer's vanished, the murder weapon's vanished, but there's no physical way out of the room. That was the very first thing I came up with, that. But the scenario, the solution to that scenario, the characters who'd have to be involved, and all of that sort of thing. And it all sort of grew from there outwards in both directions, both, towards the start, how would they get to that point, and also to the end, what happens next and how is it solved, and things like that. So that came first, and then it just circled out from there. And some of it evolved as I was writing, and then there were some bits actually that I went back and added in, entire sort of subplots right at the very end, literally like weeks before I sent it to my agent.
Thank you. I'm just wondering if it's not too much to ask. I seem to recall you mentioned a sequel.
I did.
Yeah. So will we be seeing more of John Tyler?
We will. If you can, I don't know if you can just see behind me, there's a lot of ships on this wall here, which is my sequel wall. I've just sent it to the publishers. So it's penciled in to come out at the back end of this year. It takes place immediately after the events of Anthrax Island.
Okay, yeah.
In the run up to it literally picks up where Anthrax Island left off and then runs from then up to Christmas. So it's a 2 or 3 weeks worth of story, and it follows Tyler tasked with transporting somebody from the Alps back to England. Somebody who's not particularly willing, in the boot of his car, and he embarks on a ship that he's hired specifically for the purpose, a drug smuggling ship out of Marseille, and sets out, and unfortunately his passenger, his captive, is murdered inside the hold of the ship, with no possible way in or out, and Tyler right outside. And we head out into the Atlantic with a crew of drug smugglers and a band of mercenaries, and being pursued by some very angry people who want that person back.
Do you know, if Anthrax Island, okay, had been a standalone, yeah, that would have been, I mean, that is fabulous. It is such a gripping, people talk about a roller coaster of a ride. This is that kind of novel, without a doubt. But to think that John Tyler is going to come back to us, that is fabulous. I mean, that's just, yes. Because I think he is, again, he's that kind of protagonist that it's really easy to see. It's easy to see this guy on a screen. I can see him having a following, without a doubt. I mean, he's already gathering that following. I think, you must be so pleased with the reviews that are coming out for the book, yeah?
Really pleased. And I'm pleased that a lot of the reviews and a lot of the things that people have spoken to me about, they kind of really get it, where Tyler's coming from, and that he's a fish out of water, but he's a very capable person. And I'm really pleased, because obviously he's going to carry the story forward from here. So we'll find out an awful lot more about him in the sequel and what he's capable of.
I have a last question for you, Danny, if I may, and you might have already told me this, so if you have, no worries, but the book as a whole, is there, and again, without giving too much away, is there one aspect, because I always love asking this to writers, I know every writer is proud of their book, but is there one aspect that you think, that's the jewel, that is the moment that I just was like, oh my God, I did that?
In the story of the book?
Yeah.
A scene, or a
Yeah.
hard picking one because I've got a couple of favourites. My personal favourite's probably the car chase, but that's because I'm a car nerd, and so I really enjoyed writing that. But I think my absolute favourite is a scene fairly near the start of the book. A few chapters in, I don't want to give any spoilers away, but Tyler gets trapped, and he's in a very sticky situation, and has to kind of extricate himself from it. And it happens quite early on, and it's sort of a bit of a wake-up call for Tyler in terms of the danger he faces on the island. And I wrote that scene fairly late on. That was a really, really late addition to the book. And I was really pleased with how it came out and how it sort of propelled the action forward.
Thank you for sharing that, Danny. Thank you for taking time out to come on and talk to us about this just fabulous debut novel. And I'm so pleased to hear that it's not the only novel, that there's more to come. I know, from what I've been reading, what people have been saying, that people are looking forward to the next installment. But for now, wish you all the very best with Anthrax Island, and I look forward to when we can meet together in person. Yeah, it'd be great.
Yes, absolutely. Looking forward to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye for now, Danny. Bye.